Mastering ought to in English. Advice in action. Hello, English learners. Welcome to another session in our series on modal verbs. Today, we'll focus on an interesting modal verb often used for advice. Ought to. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly how and when to use ought to give advice or make recommendations. Let's dive right in. Ought to is a modal verb used to express something that is probable, expected, or desirable. Today we're focusing on its role in giving advice. When using ought to, the main verb that follows it must be in the base form. For example, you ought to study. Here, study is the base form of the verb. The construction is simply subject plus ought to plus base form of the verb. When giving advice, ought to suggests that doing something would be a good idea, but it's your choice. It's similar to should, but slightly less strong. For instance, you ought to see a doctor. It would be a good idea. We ought to clean the house before our guests arrive. It would be a good idea. Remember, it's not usually used in questions, and it's less commonly used in negative sentences. When talking about something in the past that didn't happen but was the right thing to do, we use ought to have, followed by a past participle. For example, I ought to have called you. I'm sorry, I didn't call you, but it would have been the right thing to do. As mentioned earlier, ought to is rarely used in questions. Instead, we often use should. But if you do encounter it, it's typically in a formal context. Example, ought they to be informed about the changes? And there you have it, the many ways to use ought to when giving advice. Remember, practice is key. So, start implementing ought to in your conversations or writings. I hope you found this session informative. Stay tuned for our next video where we'll continue exploring modal verbs. Until then, keep practicing and happy learning.